My name is Leah Gibson. I am a faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the Art Therapy Department. I have been there as full-time faculty for the last 3 years, and I have been an art therapist, since 2010, so about 11 years now. Um, so I am also very grounded in work in Chicago, so it'll be interesting to kind of, when we talk about trauma, to talk about various contexts and sort of contextual understandings of trauma. But yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Oh, no, thank you for joining. That is a good point. Trauma in context. In this conversation that's around trauma and faith and how we inhabit that space and how some spaces of faith and ritual do not try to inhabit that space at all. I think the contextualizing definitely makes sense. And so can you tell me how you got involved in this field in the first place? Like, how does one find themselves in art therapy?
You know, it's interesting because it's probably a really different answer to any art therapist you'd ask, and maybe to any person that you'd ask in the mental health field. I'm not one of the art therapists, I think, who always knew that art therapy is what I wanted to do. I found out about art therapy later, quite late in undergrad, and I was primarily on kind of a track, a more commercial track as an artist. But in my kind of social and extracurricular kind of world, I was heavily involved in various kinds of activism around Black women and health. And so I think it's probably a few kind of core roots to the things that I sort of knew to do just as a part of my day-to-day through a background working and growing up in the Black church. I grew up Kojic, and then kind of moving into various educational spaces where I had opportunities to work with other people to do community work. And so I think those pieces came together, of course, with my interest in art, and I landed in art therapy.
So I'm interested in that. What do you see is the tie between activism and trauma? Because you sort of highlighted that work sort of led you here. So what in your activism journey that you see, oh, there's something that needs to be addressed here?
No, that's a really interesting question. You know, I'm not even sure that I've thought about this as a trajectory, you know. I've, in my work, talked a lot about trauma as something we need to understand as contextual, as something we need to understand as, in many cases, preventable. And, you know, you're right. I think that I didn't begin with an explicit lens around trauma, but I did build an understanding of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination and oppression, right? We're talking about oppression far, far beyond discrimination. And so I think you have no choice but to recognize what trauma is when you have both a lived experience and these, you know, encounters with other people, where you start to kind of recognize what this medicalized term trauma is referring to really comes out of a number of social constructions that are coming together and causing people to experience basically what would be, you know, the experience that your life is threatened, or, you know, your life is endangered, whether that is a single event or whether that is an ongoing set of circumstances.
Yeah, and in that, I'm also hearing that as you begin dissecting why certain people respond in certain ways. Once you begin dissecting that, it's very not necessarily easy, but eventually you can see that people are reacting to stimulus, right? That people aren't just reacting inwardly; they're reacting to an environment that they're experiencing, and based upon those experiences that they've had, that will lead to an action of either retreating, either fighting. It's fight or flight, right? And seeing how that fight or flight begins playing out in our realities based upon the experiences that we had. And I guess the next thing I'm curious about is what happens when we don't even know or are incapable of naming those things, right? Why we're either so angry or why we withdraw ourselves. What is the impact in trauma when we can't even name it as trauma? What do you see there?
Well, that's kind of a part of a fundamental understanding of trauma is that it's something that's lived. It's a part of your body, right? And so part of why trauma treatment has to take into consideration these somatic experiences that are inherently difficult to name, to give language to. It's, in terms of how people in the field of mental health talk about the brain and neuroscience. That's one way of just explaining, hey, the body is experiencing things all of the time that we're not putting language to, right? We're not constantly narrating our life experiences, right?
Yeah.
And then especially when you're in this heightened, physiological state, you're just trying to survive. Mm-hmm. So the narrative is completely fractured. You can, even if you can sort of if you can think of an instance that may not have been traumatic, but maybe just like startling or frightening, the level of adrenaline and the kind of recounting what happened, it can be in sounds, it can be in something you saw, or, it could be just in kind of this inward feeling that just comes out, right? So whatever that bodily response is becomes the language that you have. So it's not always that people cannot give language to these experiences, but it's that maybe one of the first languages available is through the body.
Mm. And that makes me think of the work of the church, the work of theologians, right? Which is my understanding of my work as a pastor, my work as a theologian is to begin making sense, meaning making. How do we make meaning out of our interactions with ourselves, others, and God, right? And I try to start at that point, whether that's through rituals, whether that's through prayers, what's going on in my body, and then make meaning out of that for myself and for others. And so what do you see as sort of the church's role in identifying those latent or even obvious traumas in the body for their congregation? How do you see the church as a vehicle for naming those things?
Well, the first thing is, again, about the context, really assuming that you don't have anyone in your midst, who, that's such a churchy word, in your midst.
In your
midst.
Yes,
midst is such a churchy word.
Like the phrase, it's a season for the time.
Yes. Yes. Right. So just really assuming that you don't have anyone who is a part of your congregation who's experienced trauma would be the wrong move, right? That we should actually know how prevalent violence is in our society, how prevalent poverty is in our society. And these are the kinds of experiences that are allow people to be susceptible and vulnerable to traumatic experience, right? Just having a cultural context in which it's simply normal to be in a state of fear for your life. And, you know, we're in that moment right now, sort of perpetually, as we are dealing with COVID-19, right? So even more so now, it's, you know, a starting point is to just recognize that every community is going to have a wide range of experiences that people have. And so because you recognize that, you have to think with intention about the kind of space you're creating, the kind of space that you're investing in, and thinking about things like safety. You know, what are the things that, you know, need to be in place for people to experience safety, not simply just feel safety, but experience safety with you, right? And with your theology. If your theology is unsafe, well,
yeah. And I think that's what I'm hearing in that conversation are a lot there, but I also hear two things. One is the responsibility to know, right? The responsibility to be aware of what's happening both inside of your congregation, but outside in the world. That maybe this is sort of the dangers of a theology that we are in the world of, but not of the world. Whereas that does have context, right? That we are in the world, but we're not of the world. There's also a sense that you're then not responsible for what happens in the world, but you need to be responsible for it in order to have a theology that tackles those issues and deals with people where they are in the space that they are, right? And so it's not enough to be a church in a safe neighborhood, in a quiet neighborhood, or in a small village if the people around you don't feel that safety as well.
exactly.
And so one part would probably mean that you need to go outside of your space and outside of your context and to know what's going on. It sounds like the second part of that conversation is having the space where people feel free to be vulnerable, which means that like in a leadership position or even if you're a youth, teenager or an adult, if the people around you aren't allowing people to question their faith or to say how they're really feeling, if I have to come into church with a smile and leave out with a smile, or if I have to, in some like Black congregations, for instance, how are you feeling? Blessed and highly favored. If I'm not feeling blessed and highly favored, right, there should be a response to that. That is clear in our worship service, but also in how we perform worship, along with that space. Have you been a part of a community where you felt they may not be, but they are doing some things right?
My internet just cut you off for just a second. Can you ask that one again?
Have you been in a space where you felt like this might not be great, but they're doing some things right?
Absolutely. I absolutely have been in a space of faith in that way. My church actually in Chicago, St. Martin's Episcopal Church, like any congregation, has its struggles. But I think as a community, the work that is being done there is often addressing a lot of the religious-based traumas that people experience because of their identities. And I think that that's another piece of creating safety is coming out and letting people know where you stand on certain things. Because you know, if you're someone who's experienced trauma, you have a sort of heightened sense of awareness, and you're looking for those key signs that would let you know whether a space is safe for you or not. And so sometimes really being transparent about your ideas, and specifically in response to historical harms that have been associated with the church, can be just one way of sort of extending that safety. And you have to back it up, right? You can't just say that you're affirming, or that you are bringing in a more liberatory theology, right? You can't just say those things and not practice them, because people also can tell the difference.
Yeah. Could you name a couple of religious-based trauma, faith-based trauma that, or even like phrases that people might hear that sort of either impede that growth or perpetuate that trauma? Because I'm thinking in my head phrases like, just pray it away, that like, God will take care of it. Don't worry about it. Just pray about it, and God got that. Those type of things where I feel like they just perpetuate the trauma and they don't actually acknowledge it.
Well, I would say this to be generous enough to appreciate all of the different forms of expression that people kind of codify and express. I've said expression, but right, that people sort of share their faith in these quick sayings that don't quite capture perhaps all that is behind those sayings. And so maybe the belief, a deep held belief in the power of prayer, can be, for many people, what helps them cope and get through traumatic experiences, and does not necessarily have to negate one's awareness of their own history and lived experience. And oftentimes this is simply an articulation, I think, not even simply, but in a very complex way oftentimes. But I think an example then is to sort of take a saying like that and allow that to shape every possible scenario in one way, right? That anytime you have a set of beliefs that close down your options when you are responding to trauma and you need more options, then that's going to be something that's going to perpetuate further harm. So it's really about, well, what's available here? If prayer is a part of that practice that allows people to be in their bodies and feel safe, right? Prayer could be one of those spaces where a person who is constantly feeling anxious, fearful, agitated, any kind of sense of heightened arousal because of that trauma response. If prayer is a part of helping to provide some relief from that, then we definitely want to encourage that, right? It's the message that communicates, well, if prayer doesn't work in this instance, in this moment, or if you don't feel that relief, or if you're constantly having to pray about it and you didn't necessarily get over it, those kinds of, I think, just ways of, again, reducing and, minimizing the complexity of people's lived experiences, or things to stay away from.
Yeah, I hear that maybe the ritual, the action is important, but once again, to get back to the context of it, the context of how it's being used is just as important. That you're doing things that are life giving. I feel like in a lot of communities, people are doing that, right? Like I think that in Black communities in particular, prayer is a big part of that. In white communities that I've been a part of, small groups are a part of that, and like or evangelical communities that I've been a part of, confession time, confession at the altar time becomes a part of that experience. I guess that my brain is then saying that beyond those moments, it's also important that as people of faith, that when that's not enough, that we at least help someone find the resources that they need. Like we don't like as a youth pastor myself, I don't want to be the person that you go to. I'm not your psychiatrist, right? At best, I'm a counselor, at best, but I am not a psychiatrist. I'm not your therapist. And so I feel like it's a part of my responsibility that when something is beyond my context, beyond my limitations, that I help my congregation find the thing that they actually need to get help. But I've also seen places where going to a counselor or going to a therapist brings its own anxiety, where people will say, well, we don't do that, or we don't do those things. Do you feel like there's a better way that people of faith can talk about getting help for their trauma?
That's an interesting question about better ways, because again, I'll go back to the cultural context, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, hopefully we are in a moment in which there's at least more of a public conversation happening around mental health
Yeah.
and trauma. And, you know, given again what is happening with the pandemic, there is that kind of always available sense that your mental and emotional well-being is a part of all of these other parts of you, right, that have to be cared for. So I don't think that, you know, faith leaders will have a hard time moving towards that kind of growing popular sense that there are multiple ways for us to take care of ourselves.
Have you seen that sort of change, maybe from the time when you started to now? Are you seeing more people talk about therapy, more people talk about their mental health and trauma in a more positive sense?
Definitely the idea of seeking services seems to be at least something that is talked about. But, you know, there are so many different types of barriers. One being just simply not having a healthcare system in this country where you can go to a therapist, any therapist, without having to pay a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are, of course, private organizations and options for people if you have insurance. But if you're not in that boat, you are largely left to fend for yourself. And that really shouldn't be, right? That people need access to all types of healthcare.
Yeah, that's just more traumatizing, right? When you know you need help, you know the help is available, but you can't get it.
Right.
But you see other people being able to get it. Like it, yeah. That just it just makes me think of people. If people have seen the old Tupac video where he's talking about seeing food at a restaurant and you're hungry and like eventually you're like knocking at the window, but eventually you're like breaking the window because you're like no one's helping you get those services. And what happens when the breaking of the window in the case of the United States becomes the police departments and prisons and jails. for all these people who have experienced trauma but are not receiving the care that they need wind up in our prison industrial system.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is a hard one to deal with, but I think it's also a call to faith, right? If we're able to acknowledge that we are humans in this world experiencing things, and that our call is to love ourselves and love others and love God, then we have to also acknowledge the services that they need and what we can do
Absolutely.
about it. We're bordering at the end of this conversation, Leah, and I appreciate your time and your thought process. One of the things that we do here at the end is challenge for the teenagers, for the college students, for the adults who are listening in, about understanding better trauma and faith within their context. What would your challenge be for a church? Yeah, all this is great, but we don't financially have the resources to maybe have a counselor on board, or all this is great, but we don't feel comfortable bringing up things. What would your challenge to that type of group be?
Well, I tend to, I'm not very good at dealing with the comma but in those kinds of statements, because I would say, something along the lines of, well, you find a way to raise offering to pay the light bills. You find a way to raise offering to have your building. You find a way to raise offering to pay whatever, expenses that are there to make sure that people of faith have a place to come together. And if you are going to be responsible for bringing people together and sharing in that space and sharing in community, it is just as important to make sure that people are able to be filled with the resources that they need, right? When they're coming together in that community, right? You don't want to perpetuate harm by saying, well, this is not a priority within the set of priorities that we have, or the set of limitations that we have. This is, as you're problem solving, as you're doing all of your problem solving for the various kinds of obstacles, very real, financial obstacles that you may be facing as a community, that this is also a part of your plan, right? To support and build up your community, is that you have to have space for people to get what they need. So if it's about building coalitions, if it's about partnerships, if it's about resource mapping, finding out what strategies have existed in other communities, right? So there's always going to be something that you can do, even if it is having something that's infrequent, right? Someplace to start. But yeah, the comma but is not typically my strong suit, because I'll usually answer with a maybe we can work harder to think about the solutions that might be available here.